Right, welcome once again. My name is Martin Duddek. I've been introduced already. I'm Electric Mobility Manager in the Lower Saxon Federal State Authority for Road Construction Transport, NLSTBV. And I'm very glad to be here today and present one of the important topics, the compilation of individual charging infrastructure concepts for the transport or traffic turnaround. So what am I going to be talking about? I'll present our team, very small team. We started our work in 2021 as a team. Then we'll talk about our motivation, why we're actually doing what we do, why we as the federal state are running this program. And then we'll enter into the topic proper, the individual charging infrastructure concept, and give you an outlook. And then that will have been it. Okay, so this is the team. As I said before, we have a small team consisting of 5 people. Our head of the team is Kirsten Haug. She runs the whole team. Then we've got Ms. Kiel, who is responsible for public relations, anything to do with that. Then we have 3 electric mobility managers. They all started working in 2021 and were hired in 2021 for this particular subject. We deal with the operational tasks that we have to deal with in this environment. As Mr. Faulstich already said, we not only have the compilation of charging infrastructure concepts as our task, we had a funding program by the federal state that we're still working on and wrapping up. And apart from other topics, there's another important one, which is the electrification of the federal state properties of Lower Saxony and the electrification of our fleet. So there's a lot that needs doing. So our motivation, why are we actually doing this? If we look at the climate objectives of the federal state government, they're very ambitious. And in 2019, in the sector of transport, we had 160 million tons of CO2 equivalent of emissions. And if we look at the climate goals of the federal government until 2030, a reduction of the transport sector of 48% will have been achieved in comparison to 2019. And what does that mean for us? 48% would mean either 48% of the vehicles would no longer be driving, which is not realistic because the registration figures are going up, or 48% of the vehicles as of 2019 would be carbon neutral. And this is the objective that we have set ourselves. This is where we want to get to and must get to. How do we want to do this? One of our approaches is, well, Lower Saxony is a very big federal state. 1/10 of the area of Germany, I think, is in Lower Saxony. And we thought about how to cover this area and how charging infrastructure could be supported. So we arrived at the result that we have to get into the municipal structures, to the districts, and independent boroughs. So for the districts and for the county boroughs, we've offered some degree of cooperation to compile individual charging infrastructure concepts that are really focused on the different districts. And our approach is that this should be supply-oriented. So when we say supply-oriented, this means that the citizens in the municipality or in the respective districts are provided with a charging infrastructure, or we want to ensure that charging infrastructure is available for them for the ones who don't have the opportunity of using their own wall box, who don't own their own house, who don't, have the opportunity of just charging the car when they're at home, who rely on public charging infrastructure. And we also want to create this supply because we want to make charging infrastructure visible to the public. So to our mind, people can only identify with this whole technology if the charging infrastructure is there, is present. And we also have a strategic approach. So we have seen time and again that a charging spot is set up at some point near a transformator, for instance, on a parking lot, for instance. The DC charging spot is there, but it's at an impossible location because it isn't used by people as it should be, because there's nothing surrounding it that would attract any public, so that people would approach other DC charging spots. This is what we want to avoid. We want to look at those locations where people go to anyway, where they spend time, and this is where we really want to set up charging infrastructure to ensure that people can actually use it and accept it, and that it becomes visible, because people only realize it's there when they're going to places they go anywhere. So what do? We talk to the communities, to the municipal authorities, 2 or 3 across different levels. And then we explain the range of our cooperation and also explain decisive aspects that I'm going to go into in a minute, what aspects we've actually picked out that we consider to be particularly important. And then together with the people on site in the municipality, we really compile a charging structure concept, because the people on site, of course, know best where other people will spend a lot of their time. And then at the end of the day, all the results that we've compiled from this common work will then flow into a charging structure concept. And it's not us who write the charging structure concept, but we support the districts in compiling this. The districts are to write these concepts themselves, because this kind of concept is sort of dynamic. We have developments regarding private economy, that charging infrastructure is supplied by private businesses, so that the status changes all the time. And this needs to be taken into account. So the districts need to know how this works, what's actually being done. It won't work if we just compile something and present it to them. And another important aspect, the participation is voluntary for all the districts and independent towns and boroughs. We don't force anyone to participate, but of course we're very glad when people get involved. Feedback has been very good so far, so we're very happy that apart from one district that hasn't agreed to cooperate, this has worked. It's also, by the way, free of charge, this cooperation, so we provide a lot of support, blueprints, we train the staff of the different districts when it comes to identifying locations. So I think this is also why the response has been so positive. As I mentioned, that we identified some important aspects when it comes to compiling a concept. There are 5 aspects, 5 main aspects. We have a concept in order to really compile these programs that cover these 5 aspects. So first of all, the demand and supply, how many charging points are actually needed to cover this demand for public charging in the respective regions, districts. Then the location is the next aspect. Where does the charging infrastructure need to be set up? Is it AC/DC that's needed, or just DC, and how quickly does this have to be set up? And then, does it fit in with the grids? can we actually get there? This will be reflected in the costs. And then at the end of the day, we have a timeline, priorities for implementation. When is this going to be set up? Which are the most important charging spots and which are the not so important charging spots that could follow later on? So this is how we do it. How do we determine the demand and the supply? We look at the number of inhabitants of the districts and regions. We look at the registration figures, of the municipal vehicle registration figures. Before Corona, that's our reference year, in comparison to that. So we look at the single-family homes and 2 or more family homes. We look at the residential housing situation. And what do we actually do? We look at the number of inhabitants and the number of registered vehicles, put them into connection, and the 48% that has to be reduced until 2030. There's another factor, the share of urban and rural. So we look at the size of this community, and we've developed factors as to how big the public charging demand is. These figures are not set in stone. If we go on site, of course, we are very glad to get feedback. Maybe the factor of 1.5 doesn't fit anymore. For the first example, maybe the demand has gone up because the housing situation has changed in comparison to what we expected, or the basis that we took. And then a public charging demand is identified. How many vehicles in a certain community would have demand for public charging? We assume that every vehicle drives 50 kilometers per day. We simplified things. I think it's probably 40 kilometers per day, but in order to have a better overview and to calculate more easily, 50 kilometers with 10 kilowatt hours, 20 kilowatt hours per 100. So half would be 10 kilowatt hours for 50 kilometers. That's the basis for our calculation in order to have the figure for the required charging infrastructure. This is what the regions should supply in order to meet the demands of the people on site. Then moving on, we have, okay, this is the required charging capacity, and then we split it up into the different charging spots. And this is done against the background of the identification of the locations where 2 AC systems are that are entered here in the list, and then that would have the demand that is reflected in the provided charging structure capacity. So if demand and supply are identical, then you would have achieved, at least on paper, what you need. Then the locations for the charging infrastructure, how do we approach that? We'll look at 3 criteria: frequency of transport, how many people go there, how long do they spend. So we've got one on the upper right-hand side. This is a DIY parking spot. How much time do you spend there? Maybe half an hour, 3/4 of an hour. We have a DC charging station here, which is quite well suited to sort of charge your car in between. This is in front of a swimming pool. An AC charging unit would be suitable here because nobody wants to jog out of the swimming pool and unplug their car right in time. So the AC charging unit is quite suitable here. Then we look at the availability of the parking spots, charging spots. We look at whether this spot is always also suitable for reusing areas. Maybe you only have 3 parking spaces. You can't electrify all 3 because otherwise you run into trouble. So you really have to look at it. And the grids are important. Will things work the way we planned? In this particular case, on the lower right-hand side, we see lots of charging units and we have to look at the length of the lines because maybe they won't be profitable anymore if you have, depending on the situation you have, you probably can't build that many. Then we look at the identification of the locations. As I said at the outset, we look at people on site who know their region, their city. They know where the best locations would be. So this is where the competency lies. And we train these people in such a way that they can estimate what type of charging infrastructure, how much charging infrastructure would be suitable where specifically. And as a result, we get this location map. We see lots of little bubbles here. We see AC and DC spots in green and red. And then HPC is also DC, as you know, but we differentiated between HPC and DC, but the HPC ones are even faster. And they're the blue bubbles. So the results that we have in identifying locations are then passed on to the grid operators in order to analyze whether this is actually feasible. Regarding also the cost structure, some locations will fall through because it's just not possible or not profitable, but this is how we proceed. And then as a result, we have a major compendium with all the identified charging spots in them. They also prioritize, so within the municipalities, there's a very clear prioritization stating which one is the most important one and which ones aren't all that important. So we have an overall overview of what we need to set up until 2030. This is a good foundation for practical implementation. I'll get back to that in a second. And it's also a good foundation for the planning of the grids because the grid operators will also know what they're planning on, also on the basis of these plans. And when it comes to grid operators and energy suppliers, we really are in contact constantly to check whether this is possible. So these concepts are tried out first at the very small local level to check whether what we actually thought up works. And then we scaled it up to the districts because we eliminated some of the errors that we had in the beginning. This was our first model municipality, Gießen. By the way, we had a great team there, cooperated really, really well and learned a lot from each other. And that brings me to this point. So how are we going to proceed? So at the moment, we are working on devising these charging infrastructure concepts for all the districts. More than half of Lower Saxony is already on our side after 2 years of work. I think that's quite a good balance. We have concluded quite a few charging infrastructure concepts, and in 7 districts, there are also charging infrastructure concepts that were already in place that these districts actually compiled by themselves. Of course, they go into a lot of detail regarding data density, but that can't be our focus going in depth so much. But we want to cover as much space as possible. And the next thing would be once we've identified the spaces and areas, we want practical implementation to start. So we are working on a guideline for the compilation of the awarding of concessions. And here you could sort of have packages. DC charging sites are often very lucrative for external operators. AC sites aren't that attractive, so that you can put these two together saying, well, you can earn some money, but if you take this DC offer, you'll get an AC unit to boot. And we really want to market these areas. We want to find operators who will be responsible for the charging infrastructure on site. Because municipal structures won't be operators themselves. It's a very complex kind of business. It involves a lot of work, and we can't really provide all that. Yes, well, that brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope that I was able to convey what we do, and thank you very much for your attention.